going to talk about the technique or the research method of what anthropologists call fieldwork and how it relates to what we were talking about, the issue or the idea, the concept of culture. So if we remember from before the break, there was a pattern or an idea set up with European and North American societies that other societies, other peoples were in a position of inferiority. And part of that was because of the literal way in which Europeans and North Americans had ordered the world and deliberately placed people in situations of hierarchical inferiority and superiority. But then they would justify that by means of thinking that this was a divinely ordered or a biologically ordered or an evolutionarily ordered point of view. And so anthropologists, as we discussed, started to go out to these other places, other societies, and anthropologists weren't all good people. Maybe none of them were, but they at least wanted to plant themselves in these other places and look at what people were doing. And eventually, in contrast to some of these ideas that people had about the inferiority of others, anthropologists have come to describe what other people do as, hey, interesting, smart. We might even be able to learn something from it, or at least understand how our own life has these kinds of cultural patterns. One of these is the idea of language, and that's what we'll be talking about on Thursday. So in contrast to ideas that there were only a few real languages and that other languages were somehow inferior or didn't communicate well, or were like baby talk, anthropologists have described the complexity and difference of many of the world's languages. The rest of these things, don't write these things down, or if you do, they're just on your syllabus because they're the things that we'll be studying in the third part of class. So these, I'm just giving you a preview of the stuff that's going to come to us after the exam when we're going to be looking at various aspects of human life, which again, some people have looked out and said, aha, those people, we have real religion and they have who knows what. And so we're going to be looking at other religions, other rituals, belief systems. We're going to be looking at how people organize their lives in terms of their subsistence systems and economic systems. We've talked a little bit about that with hunters and gatherers, for example. We'll be looking at political organizations, ways in which people are able to govern themselves, looking at different ways in which people get married to each other and form kinship ties and families, and different ways of thinking about sexes and genders, all that fun stuff. Different ideas about health and healthcare and what it means to be a healthy person in a society. Techniques that people have developed in order to live sustainably and to be able to be friendly to their own society and to the earth. And so basically, what anthropologists have insisted is that these patterns are not given to us by the natural world. They're not given to us by our biological capacities. They are things that we learn. They are cultural patterns. And we can also learn these patterns by doing what anthropologists call ethnographic fieldwork. So we are not locked into, although we may think that our own way of doing things is superior, we're not locked into our own way of doing things. We can learn what other people do as well, and we can take that as lessons back to ourselves. So, like I said, we in this unit talked about the idea of culture, and we're talking on Thursday about the idea of language. This other stuff is what's on the horizon, what anthropology has learned over the last 100 years or so. So the idea of ethnographic fieldwork is actually founded on something that we call participant observation. It's it's not a, I guess I would say, like the concept of culture, it's not hugely complicated. It's basically, I would say that you go there and you observe what people are doing, but you also attempt to participate. Now, you don't become a full participant. You could never, I mean, you're fully participating, but you're not a full member of that society. You're not trying to, what some people call, go native. But you're not purely an observer or a neutral observer as well. You are putting yourself and your body, your mind, your whole self, your whole person into another society and trying to understand what people are doing from their own point of view. So anthropology should not ever be spying on people, not trying to spy. We need to ask people. We want to have what is called informed consent. So people should know what is going on. They should know that there's a study being done. This is not something that we're trying to observe from a distance. And so it's this tricky sort of insider-outsider perspective that you're trying to get on a group of people or a way of life over a certain length of time. Usually in anthropology, it's been studies, ethnographic fieldwork lasts for about a year. So it's not super long, but it's more than, more than a short time, less than a huge time. Like I said, this is not, it's not an extremely complicated method. So I like to use, one of my first professors in graduate school was Professor Sidney Mintz, who wrote a book called Worker in the Cane. He was a really great anthropological field worker, and this was actually a history of Taso, who was a cane worker in Puerto Rico at the time that the United States was increasing the plantation, basically the sugar system there was ramping it up. And a lot of what I talked about in terms of sugar and the Caribbean and things that we talked about, I take from his work and the importance of sugar in world history. But he wrote something that he called the Traditional Anthropological Catechism about what it means to do field work. And I always have kind of loved what he had to say about this and how he taught people to try and do what he did as well. A catechism, I guess for those of us who haven't been in Catholic school very long, belief, something we hold, something we learn and believe. So a traditional anthropological belief. Study what you can see and hear. Record everything you can. So you go there and do what you can. Don't expect it to be entirely consistent. So people are amazingly creative and varied and different. And sometimes we think that we're going to go into another society and everybody's going to be the same. We forget that in our own society, people are all interesting and different, and we can certainly discern cultural patterns, but those are sometimes tricky to find. And so don't expect things to just be like somebody's going to tell you what's going on. I think this is actually the most important word in his whole thing, which is to listen. And I sometimes believe that cultural anthropology is a matter of radical listening, of truly trying to figure out what people are saying and taking them seriously. Count the additional, the ancillary, the added blessings of discomfort. So a lot of anthropologists are going from a situation in which they might have been relatively privileged position from some sort of educational situation in which they've been taking classes and hopefully had a good time taking classes, into a place where, they might be in a different situation. So what Mintz, I think, is saying here is, put your own body in the places of people who need to do things like cut sugarcane, which is pretty demanding kind of labor. What does that mean? What does it mean to be in that situation? How do people, even in these kinds of adverse situations, still manage to be culturally creative and have ideas, beliefs, all of these things? That's field work. This next part probably shouldn't write down either because too many words. It'll be up on a slide. So what Mintz said is, there's other places that are like, oh, you have to have the scientific method and you have to test a hypothesis and you have to do these things, sterner disciplines in their methodologies. And anthropology in some ways is a little bit like, just go there and try and figure out what's going on. And so Mintz is like, well, if ever the people want to do these other things, that's fine. Now, anthropologists do things like interviews, and we do surveys, and we do quantitative research as well. But again, the kind of basics of it, or the basics of participant observation, are just go there and listen. And then, of course, this is why he says, so be it, that what this has done is to reveal all kinds of things that people, at least in Europe and the United States and in other places, would not have seen if anthropologists hadn't gone there and listened and tried to figure out what was going on. So what Mintz is saying here is that even though this may not be a scientifically, you might not be able to replicate your experiment, it nevertheless helps us to imagine and understand people from different perspectives and reveal what was going on at that time. So ideally, we put field work together with that concept of culture that we talked about. In an ideal sense, when you go and do your anthropological field work, it's going to reinforce, or it's going to validate what we talked about in terms of culture. So the culture concept, you may remember, is that when you do this field work, you're going to discover that human life is patterned, that other people are not just running around in a willy-nilly random sense, but there are ways in which human life gets structured, and you can observe those in your own society and in other societies in their context. And we learn, or we learn that those patterns are not just simply given out there in the world. It's not that all the people in the Arctic behave and think the same way, or all the people in the tropics behave and think the same way, or all the people with a certain phenotype of being short and light-skinned behave a certain way, but that we learn these patterns, and that they are passed on both from our peers and from our previous generations. And so what that makes it almost impossible to do is, if you've done this kind of field work and you compare societies that are adjacent to each other and may be classified as being part of the same race, the idea that people are determined, their capacities are determined by their race, is really not going to be something that you'll be able to support from doing anthropological field work. And so the idea of doing anthropological field work is to write down, film, describe, inscribe all of the ways in which people are different from each other in different groups, so across human groups, but also within a particular group, that people are not going to be all the same. So again, we do the field work here together with the culture concept, because part of the same thing and part of the same process. It's that In some ways, by going out and putting yourself with another group of people, you become aware of the whole idea of culture that we talked about.